The key felt cold and alien in my hand, a small, jagged piece of brass that didn't belong to any lock in my life. Yet, I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that it would open the one thing my husband, Richard, had kept locked for 40 years. His father's old leather briefcase. It sat on the top shelf of his closet, a silent, brooding presence I'd dusted for decades. He'd always told me it was just filled with dusty, meaningless papers from his father's failed business, a reminder of what not to be. But the look in his eyes when he said it, a fleeting shadow of something hard and possessive I'd learned to ignore, told a different story. And tonight, on my 60th birthday, surrounded by the ghosts of laughter from a party that celebrated a life I was no longer sure was mine, I was done ignoring the shadows. Finding the key had been an accident, a sliver of fate. I'd been searching for a misplaced earring in Richard's sock drawer, my fingers brushing against a false bottom I never knew existed. There it was, nestled in soft velvet. Not an old cufflink or a forgotten tie pin. A key he had deliberately hidden. My heart had seized, not with suspicion at first, but with a strange, wifely curiosity. Perhaps a secret gift? But the key was old, tarnished. The feeling it gave me was not one of happy anticipation. It was dread. The click of the lock opening was deafening in the silent house, a sound that seemed to crack the very foundation of our lives. The party was over, the laughter of our children and grandchildren now just a faint echo in the grand rooms Richard had built for us, brick by perfect brick. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, wild drumbeat against the smooth, practiced rhythm of my life. For 4 decades, I had been Mrs. Richard Sterling, the adored wife, the perfect hostess, the happy matriarch of a flawless family. I had lived a dream woven from the finest threads of security and love. But as I lifted the stiff leather flap, the smell of aged paper, brittle with time and bitter with secrets, filled the air. It was the scent of a tomb being opened. And I knew, with a sickening, gut-wrenching clarity, that I was about to wake up. Inside, nestled among yellowed stock certificates and brittle property deeds bearing his father's name, was not his history but my own. It was a stack of letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon, the kind I used to braid into my hair as a girl. I recognized the handwriting instantly, and the recognition was a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. The familiar, looping script of my brother, David. My brother, who had been dead for 39 years. My breath caught, a painful, jagged thing in my throat. These weren't just letters. They were a ghost's testimony. And as my trembling fingers untied that fragile ribbon and unfolded the first page, the floor gave way, and my entire life, my carefully curated, beautiful life, began to crumble into dust. Tell me where you're watching from, and if you have a feeling this is more than just a family misunderstanding, subscribe to the channel. Because I promise you, the truth is darker than you can possibly imagine. The first letter was dated a week before David's accident. The paper was so fragile I was afraid it would disintegrate in my hands. Ellie, it began, his old nickname for me. A name no one else had ever used. A name that felt like a secret key to a part of myself I had buried with him. I'm worried about Richard. I know you're head over heels. And I see the way he looks at you. I want to believe it's real, but there's a desperation in him lately. A hungry ghost behind his eyes. He's making moves with the company's money. Risky ones, borrowing against assets we don't have, making promises to investors I know we can't keep. When I question him, he just smiles, that charming smile of his, claps me on the shoulder, and tells me to trust him. You've got to risk it for the biscuit. Dave, he says, but something feels wrong. Ellie, it feels like he's running from something. And he's dragging our company, and my future, down with him. My mind spun. A nauseating carousel of images. I tried to reconcile the image of my steadfast, endlessly reliable Richard with the reckless gambler David described. Richard, who handled our finances with such meticulous, paternalistic care that I never had to worry about a single bill. Richard, who, after David's death, had mourned with a grief so profound, so theatrical, it had seemed to rival my own. He had held me through the long, dark nights, his tears soaking my pillow, whispering, "We'll get through this. Eleanor, I'll take care of you, I'll take care of everything." And I, drowning in my own sorrow, had clung to him like a lifeline, and he had taken care of everything after David's tragic hiking accident. A slip on a loose rock on a treacherous trail, the police had said. Richard had taken the reins of their fledgling tech company. He had worked tirelessly. His grief apparently fueling an astonishing ambition. He had transformed their small, struggling startup into a corporate giant, he'd built this house, our fortress of happiness. From the ground up, he'd given me two beautiful children, Mark and Sarah, and a life of such comfort and ease that it felt like a fairy tale, a life I felt I hadn't earned, but had been gifted by this remarkable man. I had loved him for it. I had worshipped his strength, his resilience in the face of such a devastating tragedy. I had believed our shared grief over losing David was the sacred bedrock on which our unshakable marriage was built. Now, holding this brittle paper, a seed of an ugly, unthinkable suspicion took root in the fertile soil of my gut. The accident had been so convenient with David, the cautious, ethical partner, gone. Richard had sole control. All the risk and all the reward became his. The hero who saved the company from the brink was also the sole beneficiary of the original partner's demise. I pushed the thought away, a wave of physical nausea rolling through me. This was Richard. My Richard. A man who still brought me coffee in bed every single morning, who still held my hand with a lover's tenderness when we walked down the street, who looked at me with an adoration that was the envy of all my friends. I was being foolish, letting a cryptic 40-year-old letter from a worried brother poison my mind on my own birthday. I was letting a shadow from the past desecrate the beautiful reality of the present. With a shaking hand, I forced myself to read through the rest of the letters. They painted a rapidly darkening picture. David growing more and more concerned, Richard becoming more and more secretive and volatile. One letter detailed a heated argument in their office, where David had discovered Richard had taken out a secret loan in the company's name. He told me it was to cover a temporary shortfall. Ellie, but when I pressed him, he got that cold look in his eyes. The charm vanished for a second. He looked like a complete stranger. He told me I was naive, that I didn't understand how the real world worked. He scared me. The last letter was dated the day before he died. Its frantic, slightly slanted script spoke of a desperate urgency. I have to confront him. Ellie. I found something in the books. It's not just risky. I can't even write it down. It's a betrayal I can't comprehend. I've called a meeting for tomorrow morning at the old quarry. Away from the office, away from any listening ears. I need to look him in the eye. Wish me luck no matter what happens. No, I love you. The old quarry. My blood turned to ice. That's where they found him. The police report, which I had read through tears 100 times, said he'd gone for a solo hike to clear his head before a big meeting. A tragic, freak accident, but he wasn't alone. He was going to meet Richard, my husband, the man I loved. The air in the study felt thick, unbreathable, heavy with the weight of unspoken history. I sank into Richard's plush leather chair, the one he sat in every night to review his work. The throne from which he had orchestrated our perfect life. The briefcase sat open on the desk, a Pandora's box I could never close for 40 years. I had lived in the warm, brilliant light of his success, content and blissful now. The shadows I had so dutifully ignored were coalescing into a monstrous shape. I could no longer deny my dream wasn't a dream. It was a carefully constructed stage, a meticulously managed illusion, and I was beginning to realize, with a horror that hollowed me out from the inside, that I was the only one who hadn't known I was an actor. The next morning, the smell of fresh brewed coffee, a scent that had been my daily comfort for 4 decades, smelled like a lie. It was acrid and bitter. I heard Richard's familiar footsteps on the stairs, the confident, steady tread of a man in absolute command of his world. A man with no secrets. He walked into the kitchen, beaming, holding a single, perfect red rose in his hand, just as he did on the day after every birthday and anniversary. Happy day after your birthday, my love. He leaned in to kiss me, but I turned my head at the last second, a small, involuntary flinch. His lips met my cheek, and the casual touch felt like a brand. He pulled back, his smile faltering for just a fraction of a second. Everything all right, darling? You look like you haven't slept. I looked at him, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in years. I didn't see the handsome, distinguished man my friends envied. I saw the fine lines around his eyes, not as marks of wisdom, but as cracks in a carefully maintained facade. I saw the distinguished silver at his temples, not as a sign of aging gracefully, but as the frost of a long, cold winter of deceit. I saw the man I had loved for 2/3 of my life. And I also saw a complete and utter stranger. A flicker of something, raw, primal fear, danced in his eyes before he expertly masked it with a look of loving concern. I found something, I said, my voice barely a whisper, rusty from disuse in a world where I rarely had to ask for anything. In your father's briefcase. The mask didn't just crack. It shattered. For one split, unguarded second, I saw it all, raw, undiluted panic. His face paled, his jaw tightened into a knot of stone. He recovered almost instantly, a master of his craft, but I had seen it. I would never unsee it. He forced a short, sharp laugh. That old thing? I told you, Eleanor, it's just junk. What have you been doing? Snooping around my study? A little birthday mischief. His tone was light, teasing, but his eyes were as hard as steel. He was testing me, trying to see how much I knew. They were David's letters, Richard, I said, my voice gaining a sliver of strength from his visible fear. Letters to me that he never sent. Letters about you, about the company, about your risks. Oh, Ellie, he sighed, the sound a symphony of patronizing sorrow. He ran a hand through his perfectly coiffed hair. He looked at me with such pity, the way one looks at a beloved but confused pet. David was. He was a warrior, a brilliant mind, but he didn't have the stomach for the big leagues. He saw risk in every shadow. I had to make the tough calls he was afraid of. That's all that was. He was being dramatic. He said he was meeting you at the quarry, Richard. The morning he died. Silence. A thick, heavy silence that pressed down on me, sucking the air out of the room. He walked over to the coffee pot and poured himself a cup, his back to me. His movements were deliberate, controlled, a man buying himself a few precious seconds to construct his next lie. When he finally turned around, his expression was a masterpiece of deep, profound hurt. Of course he was meeting me, he said softly, his voice catching with practiced emotion. We were partners. We met all the time to discuss strategy away from the office. But he never showed up that day. I waited for over an hour. I was furious with him for standing me up. I called his apartment, no answer. Later that day, they found him. He looked at me, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Do you have any idea what it's like to live with that? To know that the last time I was supposed to see my best friend, my brother-in-law, he never arrived? To know our last conversation was an argument over the phone? He was so convincing. So tragically plausible. The old Eleanor, the one from yesterday, would have rushed to him, wrapped her arms around him, and begged for his forgiveness for ever doubting him, for rubbing salt in such an old, deep wound. But the old Eleanor was gone. She had died last night in the study. The woman standing in her place saw the performance. She saw the craft in his sorrow, the artifice in his pain. It was the best acting I had ever seen. Why did you keep the letters, Richard? I asked, my voice cold and flat, a stranger's voice in my own throat. If they were just the dramatic ramblings of a worried man, why not give them to me? Why hide them from me for 40 years? To protect you, he snapped, his voice suddenly sharp, the frustration breaking through the grief-stricken facade. The mask was slipping again. To protect you from unnecessary pain. David was stressed. He wasn't thinking clearly. Reading those letters would have only confused you, tainted your memory of him. I did it for you, Eleanor. Everything I have ever done from that day forward has been for you. The conversation, or rather the interrogation, ended there. He left for the office, claiming he couldn't bear to be in the same room with my suspicion. He left me alone in the vast, silent house that suddenly felt like a museum of lies. Everything I have ever done has been for you, the words echoed in my mind. But they no longer sounded like a declaration of love. They sounded like a justification. They sounded like the clanging of a cage door being locked. I needed an anchor in the swirling vortex of doubt. I needed to talk to my children they deserved to know the truth about. The uncle they'd never met, or maybe. A desperate part of me just needed someone to tell me I was crazy, to put the monster of suspicion back in its box so I could go back to my dream. I called Sarah first, my daughter, the compassionate one. The one with my eyes and a heart that felt everything too deeply. She listened patiently on the other end of the line as I recounted the story. My voice breaking over the phone as I read her excerpts from her uncle's letters. When I finished, there was a long, heavy pause. Mom, she finally said, her voice careful, measured, the voice of someone trying to de-escalate a hysterical person. Uncle David died a very long time ago. Dad has been a wonderful husband to you and a wonderful father to us. Are you sure? Are you sure you're not just feeling a little down after the big birthday? Maybe a bit emotional? 60 can be a hard milestone. Her gentle, rational words felt like a slap. She didn't believe me. She was humoring me. She was siding with him. Sarah, you don't understand. I pleaded, the desperation rising in my throat. The letters. His handwriting. Dad explained the letters, she said, her tone becoming a little more firm, a little more aligned with her father's logic. He was protecting you. That sounds exactly like something he would do. He's always protected us. Desperate, my heart sinking, I called my son. Mark was Richard's boy through and through. Pragmatic, logical, a bit emotionally distant. He worshipped his father, the self-made man, the titan of industry. His reaction was 100 times worse. For God's sake, Mom, he said, his voice laced with an irritation that cut me to the quick. You're 60 years old and you're suddenly trying to dig up some 40-year-old conspiracy theory? Dad built his entire life for you, for us. He took a family tragedy and turned it into a legacy that we've all benefited from. And this is how you thank him, by accusing him of. What, exactly? You're being ridiculous. And frankly, you're being cruel to him. He called me. He's a wreck. I hung up the phone, my hand shaking so badly I could barely place the receiver back in its cradle. I was completely, utterly alone. My children, the two people I had poured my entire existence into, thought I was either senile or malicious. Richard had done his job too well. He hadn't just built a financial empire. He had built a fortress of belief around himself. A narrative so compelling and so perfect that I was on the outside, a madwoman screaming at the walls, while my own family stood guard at the gates. For the next few weeks, our home became a battleground of unspoken words and heavy, suffocating silences. Richard treated me with a cloying, suffocating kindness that was more terrifying than any argument. He'd bring me shawls when there was no chill, suggest I take a nap when I wasn't tired, and talk to me in the slow, placating tones one uses for a child or an invalid. He was trying to gaslight me, to make me believe my own mind was failing me, that this whole thing was a delusion brought on by age. He'd say things like, "You seem so forgetful lately, darling," or "Maybe we should have Dr. Evans check you out, just a routine physical, to be safe." He started managing all the mail, bringing it into his study before I could see it. He intercepted my phone calls, telling friends I was resting. He suggested he take over the household accounts to take the stress off me. My dream home had become a gilded cage, and my loving husband was the warden. The more he tried to control me, to isolate and manage me, the more certain I became. The fear I'd seen in his eyes that first morning was real. He was hiding something terrible, and he would do anything to keep it buried. I knew I couldn't rely on anyone else. If I was going to find the truth, I had to do it myself. I started small, becoming a ghost in my own house. Late at night, when the rhythm of his breathing deepened into sleep, I'd slip out of bed and go down to his study. I went through his files, his desk drawers, his computer. It felt like a disgusting violation, a betrayal of the sacred trust we had shared. But I knew with a certainty that burned in my gut that he had betrayed me first, profoundly and irrevocably. For a week, I found nothing. Everything was impeccably organized. Financial records, investment portfolios, insurance policies. It was a perfect, sterile picture of a well-managed life. Too perfect. There were no loose ends, no personal scribbles in the margins, no hidden compartments. It was as if his entire life had been professionally curated and sanitized. Then, one night, my desperation leading me to the most tedious of places, I was going through a box of old tax returns from the early days. Tucked into the back of a filing cabinet drawer marked Corporate Archives 1980 to 1985, I found it. It wasn't a letter or a photograph. It was a single, folded piece of paper printed on that old green and white striped computer paper. An old bank statement from a savings and loan that had gone out of business decades ago. The account was a joint business one. David C. Miller and Richard A. Sterling. My eyes scanned the page, my breath held tight in my chest. The statement was dated for the period ending the day after David's death. I saw a series of small deposits and withdrawals, typical business expenses. And then I saw the last entry, dated the afternoon after they found David's body. A withdrawal. A wire transfer that had emptied the account down to the last penny. The amount was staggering, even by today's standards. It was the entire seed capital for their company. The money was transferred to a new account, one opened that very day. An account in the name of Richard A. Sterling and Richard A. Sterling alone. He had drained their shared company account the day after my brother died. He had told me, told the investors, told told everyone that the company was on shaky ground after David's death, that he had to use his own personal savings, every last dime he had, to keep it afloat. It was the cornerstone of his hero narrative, the story of the man who had salvaged a dream from the ashes of tragedy. It was all a lie. The money wasn't his savings. It was David's money. It was my brother's legacy, and Richard had stolen it. I felt a cold, terrifying calm settle over me. This was it. This was the proof. This was more than just risky business deals. This was grand larceny. This was a motive. A betrayal so profound it defied comprehension. I made a copy of the statement with my phone, my hands steady now. The fear was gone, replaced by a hard, unyielding resolve. Subscribe now if you haven't already. You are not going to believe what happens when the whole truth finally comes out. A few days later, my daughter Sarah called me. Her tone was different. The condescension was gone, replaced by a hesitant, gnawing worry. "Mom, I've been thinking about what you said," she began, her voice low, "and, well, you've never been one for drama. You've never been irrational. For the last week, I haven't been able to get your voice out of my head. I'm sorry I dismissed you." Tears pricked my eyes, the first tears of relief I had shed. It was the first crack in the wall of isolation Richard had so carefully built around me. "Oh, Sarah," I whispered, my voice thick. "I did something," she continued, her voice even lower, almost conspiratorial. "I don't know if it's anything, but I used one of those online public record services. I requested a copy of the original police report from Uncle David's accident. The full file. It just arrived in my email." My heart started to pound again, a heavy, painful thudding. And it's mostly what we've always been told. Accidental fall, blunt force trauma from impact. But, Mom, there's a supplemental page. A follow-up note from one of the responding officers, dated a week after the incident. He mentions a potential witness, a local fisherman who was downriver from the quarry that morning. The fisherman told the officer he thought he heard two men arguing up on the quarry cliff earlier that morning. He said he couldn't make out words, just the sound of angry, elevated voices. The officer noted that he intended to follow up with the witness and re-interview Mr. Sterling, but there's no record that he ever did. The case was formally closed the very next day, signed off by a different supervisor, two men arguing. On the quarry cliff. On the morning David died. And an investigation that was quietly shut down. "Sarah," I said, my voice tight and steely, "I need you to come over. And I need you to bring a printout of that report. We're going to have a family meeting." The dining room table, usually the stage for our happy family celebrations, was set not for a meal, but for an execution. I placed a single, thin file folder in the center of the polished mahogany surface, right where the floral centerpiece usually sat. I had called Richard home from work, telling him it was a family emergency concerning Sarah. I had called Mark and told him the same. They arrived within minutes of each other, their faces etched with concern for their sister. Richard saw me, then Sarah standing beside me, perfectly fine, and then his eyes landed on the folder. His expression hardened into a mask of stone. Mark looked from me to his father, his brow furrowed in confusion. Sarah stood by my side, a silent, supportive presence. She had seen the bank statement on my phone. She believed me now. "What is this, Eleanor?" Richard asked, his voice low and dangerous, dropping all pretense of concern. 40 years of my life, Richard," I said, my own voice surprisingly steady, clear as a bell in the tense silence. "That's what this is. 40 years of a lie." I opened the folder. I laid out copies of David's letters, one by one, like tarot cards revealing a grim future. I laid out the bank statement showing the transfer of funds. And finally, I laid out the police report, with the witness statement and the curious lack of follow-up highlighted in yellow. Mark stared at the papers, his face paling as he read. "Mom, what the hell is this?" Richard didn't even look at them. He knew what they were. He just stared at me, his eyes burning with a cold, desperate fury. "You've gone insane," he said, his voice flat. "You and your daughter, digging up dirt, manufacturing evidence, trying to destroy this family out of some senile fantasy." "The family was already destroyed, Dad," Sarah said, her voice trembling but firm. "It was destroyed 39 years ago at a quarry. That's enough. Richard roared, slamming his hand on the table, making the papers and our hearts jump. I will not be subjected to these wild, slanderous fantasies. I lost a brother that day, too. I built this life for us, for you. He yelled, pointing a shaking finger at me. Out of nothing. I gave you everything you have. You didn't give me anything, Richard, I said, my voice a blade of ice. You stole it. You stole it from my brother. You drained his bank account the day after he died, and you used his money to build your empire. This house, our vacations, the children's college funds. All of it was paid for with David's money. Money you took after he was conveniently out of the way. It was a joint business account, he spat, his face turning a blotchy red. The money was legally as much mine as it was his. That's just business, but was his death an accident? Sarah pressed, holding up the police report like a shield. The fisherman heard arguing, Dad. Two men. Angry voices. Were you the other man? Richard laughed, a horrifying, humorless sound that echoed in the grand room. A fisherman? That's your proof? The vague memory of some old drunk from 40 years ago? This is pathetic. You're pathetic. He was a cornered animal, lashing out, but the walls were closing in. Mark, who had been silent, his face a mask of conflicted disbelief, finally looked up from the bank statement. His face was ashen, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. He looked at his father, the man he had idolized, the hero of his life story. Dad? Mark's voice was a broken whisper. The money. The transfer. Is this true? That was the blow that finally broke him. Not my accusations, not the evidence, but the look of utter, soul-crushing disillusionment on his son's face. Richard's shoulders slumped. The fury drained out of him, replaced by a vast, cavernous emptiness. He sank into his chair at the head of the table, the king of a fallen kingdom, his reign over. He stared at the mahogany grain for a long, terrible time. The only sound was the frantic, mocking ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, counting down the seconds of our shattered life. When he finally spoke, his voice was a dry rasp, the voice of a very old, very tired man. He was going to ruin me, he said, not looking at any of us, his eyes fixed on the past. He found out about the gambling debts. I was young, I was stupid. I owed the wrong people a lot of money. I'd been borrowing from the company to pay them off. I always intended to pay it back, I swear I did. He looked up then, his eyes pleading, no longer with anger, but with a desperate need for a long-denied absolution. David was so righteous, so black and white. He was going to expose me. To the investors, to the police. To you, Ellie. He said I had betrayed his trust, that I was a common thief. I begged him. I told him it would destroy me, it would destroy the company, it would destroy your faith in me. But he wouldn't listen. He just kept saying I had to face the consequences. My blood ran cold. The final, awful pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture of unimaginable ugliness. We argued, he whispered, his eyes now unfocused, fixed on the memory playing out on the wall behind me. Up there on the cliff. He was yelling, calling me a disgrace. I was yelling back, pleading with him. I just wanted him to stop, to listen. I grabbed his arm. To make him face me. He tried to pull away, violently. He called me pathetic. I was so angry, so scared. I pushed him. Not hard. Just a shove, to get him to back off, to give me some space. Richard's face crumpled. A single, hot tear traced a path through the weathered skin of his cheek. He didn't scream, he said, his voice catching in a sob. His eyes were so wide, full of surprise. And then he was gone. He just tipped backward. I looked over the edge. And he was just lying there. So still. On the rocks below. I called his name. Nothing. I panicked. I knew no one would believe it was an accident. Not after he found out what I'd done. Not with the argument. So I ran. I just ran. And I told myself it was an accident. I told myself every day for 39 years. The confession hung in the air, thick and poisonous. It wasn't premeditated murder. In a way, it was worse. It was a moment of selfish, pathetic, desperate violence that he had covered up. He hadn't just let my brother die. He had pushed him. And then he had built our entire life, my entire life, on top of his grave. Every "I love you," every anniversary gift, every proud moment at a graduation or a wedding, every tender touch in the dark, every shared laugh over a bottle of wine. All of it, our entire history, was recontextualized in that one horrific, cowardly moment. It was not a love story. It was the longest, most elaborate cover-up in history. My marriage wasn't a dream. It was a crime scene. I hadn't been a wife. I had been an alibi. My body went numb. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. A strange, glacial calm washed over me. The pain was too deep for tears, too vast for rage. It was the quiet, hollow feeling of absolute, final devastation. Mark was sobbing now, his head in his hands, making deep, wounded sounds. Sarah stood like a statue, silent tears streaming down her face, her hand gripping my shoulder, holding me up. I looked at Richard, the man I had shared my bed with for 40 years, the father of my children. And I saw nothing. Not a monster, not a man. Just a void. The man I loved had never existed. He was a phantom, a story Richard had told himself, and me, and our children, to make the silence of his guilt bearable. I stood up. The chair scraped against the hardwood floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the funereal silence. "Get out," I said. My voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but it held the unbreakable weight of 4 decades of deception. Richard looked up, his face a mask of pure desperation. "Ellie, please. Please don't do this. I did it all for you. To give you the life you deserved. The life David never could have. I love you. I have always loved you." "No," I said, the single word cutting through his pathetic please like a shard of glass. "You don't know what love is. You loved the idea of this life. You loved the security. You loved that I never asked questions. But you didn't love me. You buried me alive with my brother. Now get out of my house." 3 months later, a "for sale" sign stood on the manicured lawn of the house that had once been my world. The rooms, stripped of our furniture and memories, echoed with emptiness. It was no longer my home. It was just a building, a beautiful, hollow monument to a terrible lie. I packed the last box in the living room, taping it shut with a decisive rip. It contained a few old photo albums. I had gone through them the night before, a bottle of wine and a pair of scissors, my only companions. Methodically, I had cut Richard out of every single picture from our life together. What was left were fragmented, nonsensical images. Me smiling at an empty space, the children holding hands with a void, a wedding photo of me standing next to a decapitated tuxedo. A life full of holes. My new apartment was small, but every inch of it was mine, paid for with my half of the settlement. The sunlight that streamed through the window felt clean, honest. I had lost the past I thought I knew, a past that had been stolen from me twice over. But for the first time in my adult life, the future felt real. It was uncertain and a little frightening, but it was mine to write. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was Sarah. "Coffee and 10? At our spot?" Mark was still struggling, seeing a therapist to try and reconcile the father he worshipped with the weak, criminal man he now knew. It was a long road for him. And his calls were still strained, but Sarah and I, we were forging a new path. Our bond, once strained by the family's corrosive secrets, was now the strongest, truest thing in my life. I looked around the empty room one last time, not with sadness, but with a profound sense of release. I had thought my dream life began when I married Richard Sterling. I was wrong. My real life was just beginning. At 60 years old, with the closing of a door and the quiet, unshakable knowledge that it is never, ever too late to wake up. What part of this story left you the most speechless? Comment below. I'd love to read your thoughts.